He had sentenced her without remorse, thinking she was just another black woman in his courtroom. But when she uttered 5 words, "My husband is the mayor," his entire world came crashing down. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, the kind of scent that lingered in places where lives were decided with the stroke of a pen. Angela Carter sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as if she were merely a guest in this grand hall of justice, rather than the accused. She was composed, her face unreadable, but the tightness in her jaw spoke of the storm she refused to let break. The prosecution had painted her as a heartless criminal, a woman guilty of a crime so severe that she deserved nothing less than life in prison. The charge: fraud on a federal level, embezzlement of public funds. It was a case that had been carefully constructed, designed to make her look guilty beyond doubt. But those who truly knew Angela knew she was no thief. A devoted mother, a respected figure in the community, she had spent years advocating for low-income families, fighting against the very system that now sought to devour her. Judge James Wilson sat high above, his robe draping over his broad shoulders, like the weight of the power he wielded. He was the kind of man who didn't bother hiding his biases. To him, Angela wasn't a person. She was a statistic, another black woman standing before his bench, another name to be stamped with a conviction. His reputation preceded him. The harshest sentences always fell on those who didn't look like him, those whose voices had never mattered in his courtroom. The energy in the room was palpable. Angela's lawyer, a young but brilliant defense attorney, had fought tooth and nail against the flimsy evidence presented, but Wilson dismissed every objection without hesitation. The jury, carefully selected, had been swayed long before the trial even began. The outcome was set. Everyone knew it, except Angela. She sat still, unmoving, her gaze locked on Wilson as he rifled through his papers. There was something unsettling about her silence, as if she knew something no one else did. The reporters in the gallery whispered among themselves, scribbling notes, preparing for what they assumed would be just another case of a black woman receiving an unjust punishment. A bailiff shifted uncomfortably at the corner of the room. He had noticed something about the way Angela carried herself. She wasn't desperate, nor was she pleading for leniency like so many others who had stood in that very spot. No, she exuded an eerie confidence, the kind that didn't belong to someone on the brink of losing everything. He glanced toward the judge, but Wilson didn't notice. Or worse, he didn't care. Angela's fingers tapped lightly against the table, a slow, rhythmic motion. If anyone had been paying close enough attention, they might have recognized it as a signal, a subconscious pattern she always made when she was waiting for a moment to strike. The prosecution delivered their final remarks with smug certainty, and Wilson barely waited a beat before shuffling his notes together. He cleared his throat, looking down at Angela with the detached expression of a man who saw no value in the life before him. "It is the decision of this court," he began, his voice steady and firm, "that the defendant, Angela Carter, be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A hush fell over the room. Somewhere in the gallery, a sharp inhale echoed, but Angela remained still. No reaction, no protest, nothing. And then, as the gavel came down with a deafening crack, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. All eyes turned as a man in a sharply tailored suit strode in, his presence demanding attention even before he spoke. The reporters gasped. The bailiff stiffened. The jurors exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain of the judgment they had just agreed upon. Judge Wilson looked up, his face tightening in mild irritation. The man's voice rang clear and authoritative, slicing through the silence like a blade. "Is this sentence really just, Judge Wilson?" The room froze, because standing there, fury barely restrained in his eyes, was none other than Mayor Jackson Carter, Angela's husband. For a split second, the courtroom was frozen in time. Every pair of eyes darted between Judge Wilson and the man who had just walked in. The name Jackson Carter carried weight, more weight than anyone in that room had expected. Wilson's fingers tightened around the gavel as his mind raced to process what was happening. Mayor Jackson Carter, her husband. Angela finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head toward the man standing at the entrance. Their eyes met, but there was no desperation in hers, no plea for salvation. Just an understanding, a silent exchange between two people who had been prepared for this moment all along. The murmurs in the courtroom rose into a hum of confusion. Reporters scrambled to update their notes, jurors shifted in their seats, and the prosecutor swallowed hard, realizing that this case had just slipped out of his control. Wilson cleared his throat, trying to regain dominance. "Mr. Carter, this is a court of law. You cannot simply barge in and interrupt sentencing." Jackson stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His expression remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to his voice. "I am well aware of courtroom protocol, Your Honor. I also know the weight of a wrongful conviction." Angela leaned back in her seat, watching as the room's energy shifted. Wilson, for the first time since this trial began, looked unsettled. "Wrongful conviction?" Wilson scoffed, attempting to mask his discomfort with arrogance. "This case was built on undeniable evidence." Jackson chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Undeniable evidence, or a carefully orchestrated attack?" He turned to the gallery, addressing the press directly. "Tell me, how many cases has this judge sentenced to the maximum penalty when the defendant was black? How many times has he ignored due process?" A few reporters quickly flipped through their notes, and others typed furiously into their phones. The number was staggering. Judge Wilson's name was already stained with controversy, but no one had dared to call him out so boldly. Angela's lawyer, emboldened by the mayor's presence, stood up. "Your Honor, in light of this new revelation, I demand an immediate review of this case and a suspension of sentencing." Wilson's jaw clenched. He knew what was happening. He was losing control. The mayor's influence was too powerful to ignore, and the media had already latched onto the story. But he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. "This is highly inappropriate," Wilson snapped. "You have no authority to interfere with this court's ruling." Jackson took another step forward, his voice unwavering. "No, but I do have the authority to open an investigation into your history of biased rulings, and I assure you, that's exactly what I intend to do." A ripple of tension spread through the room. The judge's face darkened, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Angela finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the courtroom with sharp precision. "You never even looked at the evidence, did you, Judge Wilson?" He turned to her, his expression hardening. "I reviewed everything necessary to make a fair judgment." Angela let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Fair. You had already decided my fate before I walked in here. It was never about justice. It was about power." The gallery erupted in whispers. Wilson's grip on his gavel was white-knuckled. He could feel the room turning against him, the once-assured victory slipping through his fingers. And then, Jackson delivered the final blow. "I've already contacted the governor's office," he said, his tone steady. "They are reviewing your conduct as we speak. I'd suggest you start preparing for a different kind of courtroom appearance, one where you're the one on trial. Wilson's face drained of color. The tension in the air was suffocating. He had spent years handing down sentences without consequence, years believing his authority was untouchable. But now, in front of cameras, journalists, and the weight of the mayor's influence, he was cornered. Angela remained seated, her expression calm. She had never needed to beg for her freedom. She had simply waited for the moment when the truth would be undeniable. And that moment had arrived. Judge Wilson's face was like stone, but his grip on the gavel betrayed him. His knuckles whitened, his fingers curling tighter, as if the wooden handle were the last thing anchoring him to power. The energy in the courtroom had shifted entirely. The weight of authority no longer rested in his seat. It had been stripped away, scattered among the murmuring reporters, the tense jury, and, most of all, the unwavering presence of Mayor Jackson Carter. Angela Carter remained seated, unmoving, her expression unreadable. She had played this game of patience, waiting for the moment when silence would be her greatest weapon. And now, it was Wilson who had to fill the void, scrambling for control as it slipped further from his grasp. "You are out of line, Mr. Carter," Wilson said finally, his voice carrying the forced authority of a man trying to maintain his footing on crumbling ground. "This court does not answer to political pressure." Jackson took another slow step forward, his movements deliberate. "Political pressure? No, Judge Wilson. This is about accountability, something you seem to believe you're above." The tension thickened, pressing into every corner of the courtroom. The reporters had stopped scribbling in their notebooks and were now holding their phones up, recording. The live stream of this trial, which had begun as a routine sentencing, was now exploding across social media. Wilson's jaw twitched, but he couldn't afford to acknowledge the cameras. He needed control. He needed order. "This is an egregious disruption of due process," he snapped, his gavel slamming down with force. "Bailiff, remove Mr. Carter from the courtroom immediately." The bailiff hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. This wasn't just any man the judge had ordered him to remove. This was the mayor. Jackson didn't move. His voice was level, but the weight behind his words was undeniable. "Go ahead. Have me removed. Let every camera in this room capture it. Let every person watching see how quickly you resort to silencing the truth when it threatens you." Wilson's breath hitched. He hadn't expected resistance. Not like this. He had built his career on intimidation, on silencing those who dared to challenge him. But now, standing before a man whose authority rivaled his own, he found himself on the defensive. Angela, still seated, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, yet it cut through the noise like a scalpel. "You've sentenced me to life without parole," she said, tilting her head slightly, "for a crime I didn't commit. But tell me, Judge Wilson, how do you think history will remember you after today?" His eyes snapped to her, sharp with suppressed anger. "Watch yourself, Mrs. Carter." But she wasn't finished. "You spent this entire trial treating me like I was beneath you. You never looked at the evidence. You dismissed every objection. You were so sure no one would stand up for me. And now, when faced with the truth, you're doing everything in your power to silence it." A murmur spread through the gallery. Jurors exchanged uncertain glances. Jackson let the moment linger before he spoke again. "The governor is watching this live," he stated, eyes locked onto Wilson's. "They are preparing to issue an official review of your conduct. Your name is already trending nationwide. You think you can gavel this away?" Wilson's fingers twitched. He had fought too long, too hard, to have his authority questioned like this. His entire career had been built on the presumption that his word was final, that no one would dare challenge him. But now, his own arrogance had become his downfall. The prosecutor, who had been standing still like a shadow, finally spoke, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, in light of these new developments, perhaps a recess is in order." It was a desperate attempt to regain control, to stall the inevitable. But everyone in that room knew that recess wouldn't save Wilson now. Angela let out a quiet breath, steady and measured. She turned toward the jury, looking each one of them in the eye. "If I was a different woman," she said, "if I had a different skin color, would you have questioned the evidence? Would you have asked if this case was as clear-cut as they made it seem?" Silence. A juror shifted in their seat, uncomfortable. Another avoided her gaze. The weight of unspoken truths bore down on them. Wilson exhaled sharply, frustrated, humiliated. "This is irrelevant to the sentencing." Jackson took one final step forward, voice firm. "No, Wilson. This is the only thing that's relevant now." The judge's gavel wavered in his grip. He knew he had lost. He had lost the moment the cameras turned against him. The moment he had underestimated the woman before him. The moment he had believed that power was something he alone controlled. A deep, resounding quiet settled over the courtroom. A realization, a reckoning. Wilson had thought today would be the end of Angela Carter's life as she knew it, but now it was the end of his. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Wilson's fingers trembled around the gavel, but he couldn't bring himself to strike it down again. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes boring into him, the cameras recording every flicker of uncertainty on his face. This wasn't his courtroom anymore. He was no longer in control. Angela Carter sat still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching him with the patience of someone who knew this moment was inevitable. She had never needed to raise her voice, never needed to beg for justice, because justice had finally turned its gaze on the man who had denied it for so long. Wilson swallowed, then forced his voice into something resembling authority. "This is not how the judicial system works," he snapped. "You think you can waltz in here and—" Jackson Carter cut him off with a single step forward. His presence alone was enough to shatter whatever illusion of control Wilson had left. "The governor's office has just confirmed a formal review of every case you've presided over in the past 10 years. His voice was smooth, measured, but each word landed like a hammer against stone. "They're calling for an immediate suspension of your duties, pending investigation." A ripple of shock coursed through the room. The reporters scribbled frantically, the jury members exchanged uneasy glances, and the prosecutor went pale. Wilson let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You think this is over?" His voice cracked at the edges, a desperate man grasping at the remnants of his authority. "I am a judge of the state. I am—" "You're finished." Angela's voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a blade. She finally rose to her feet, meeting Wilson's gaze head-on. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just the simple, undeniable truth. "You built your career on silencing people like me," she continued, stepping closer to the bench, "on making sure the powerless stayed powerless. But today, you got careless. You thought no one would care, that no one would fight back." Wilson opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Jackson turned to the bailiff. "Judge Wilson is no longer fit to preside over this case," he said firmly. "I demand an immediate overturn of this verdict." The bailiff hesitated, glancing toward Wilson, waiting for some sort of command. But Wilson had nothing left to give. His face had gone pale, his body stiff with the realization that this was really happening. And then the final blow landed. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man who had sat in uncomfortable silence throughout the trial, suddenly stood. His voice wavered, but his words were clear. "We were pressured," he admitted. "From the beginning. We were told this case was a slam dunk, that she was guilty. We didn't question it." He swallowed hard. "But we should have." Gasps filled the courtroom. The prosecutor's face twisted in horror. The reporters were already tapping furiously on their phones, the story unfolding in real time. Angela exhaled softly. She had known. She had known from the moment the jury had been selected that the verdict had been decided before the trial had even begun. Wilson slammed his palm against the bench, his face twisting in fury. "This is outrageous," he bellowed. "This is a mockery of the judicial—" The doors to the courtroom burst open once again. A state official in a crisp suit stepped inside, flanked by 2 officers. "Judge Wilson," the man announced, his voice carrying across the chamber, "you are hereby placed under formal review for judicial misconduct. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties." The room erupted. Wilson lurched forward, his mouth opening and closing in stunned disbelief. "You can't—" But they could. And they did. Angela watched as he was escorted from the bench, his face drained of all color, his once commanding presence reduced to nothing. She turned to Jackson, who met her gaze with something soft, something reassuring. It was over. But not for her. For him. The gavel never came down again. Judge Wilson had been led out of the courtroom, his protests swallowed by the murmurs of disbelief and the rapid clicks of cameras capturing his downfall. The power he once wielded had been stripped away, not by force, but by truth. Angela Carter stood still in the center of it all, her hands resting at her sides, her expression unreadable. The chains of a life sentence had been placed on her shoulders just moments ago, and now, in an instant, they had been shattered. Yet, there was no triumph in her eyes, only the quiet weight of a battle long fought. Jackson Carter turned to the court clerk, his voice calm but firm. "This conviction must be overturned immediately." The prosecutor, still in shock, could only nod, his previous confidence reduced to silence. The jury, once complicit, now looked ashamed, avoiding Angela's gaze. A court official stepped forward, clearing his throat before speaking. "Given the misconduct in this trial, the charges against Mrs. Carter are now void. She is free to go." For the first time since the trial had begun, a collective exhale filled the room. Angela closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of those words settle. Free. Not because of a plea deal, not because of mercy, but because justice had finally found its way back to where it belonged. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised, cameras flashing. "Mrs. Carter, do you have anything to say?" Angela turned to them, her expression steady. "I shouldn't have had to prove my innocence in the first place." Her voice was quiet, but the room fell silent to hear her. "And I am not the only one." A hush followed. It was a statement that would echo far beyond these courtroom walls. Jackson reached for her hand. She took it without hesitation, and together they walked out. Not in victory, but in dignity. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation. Reporters clamored for a final statement. Bystanders whispered among themselves, and the cameras never stopped rolling. But Angela Carter didn't pause. She stepped into the daylight with Jackson by her side, her expression calm, unwavering. Justice had been served, not by the system, but in spite of it. As they walked down the courthouse steps, a young woman in the crowd hesitated before calling out, "Mrs. Carter, if your husband hadn't been the mayor, Do you think this would have ended differently? Angela stopped. The question lingered, heavy, undeniable. She turned slowly, looking out at the faces before her. The people who had watched, who had doubted, who had stayed silent for too long. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. It shouldn't take power to prove innocence. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A truth so simple, so raw, yet so damning. She didn't need to say anything more. The image of her walking away, hand in hand with the man who had fought for her, would be etched into history. This wasn't just about one case. This was about every case like it. Now, it was up to the world to decide what came next. And that's where you come in. Do you think justice is truly blind? Or does it only listen when power speaks? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe. Because stories like these, they need to be told.